There are moments when protecting yourself starts to feel strangely similar to hurting someone else. You say no. You cancel something you no longer have the energy for. You stop answering immediately. You become less available. You decide not to continue a conversation that always leaves you feeling empty. And afterward, instead of relief, you feel guilt. Not a loud kind of guilt. A quiet one. The kind that follows you through the rest of the day. The kind that makes you replay the conversation in your mind, searching for signs that you are too cold, too distant, too selfish. You wonder if you could have explained yourself better. You wonder if you should send another message. You wonder whether protecting yourself was really necessary. Because for a long time, love may have looked very different. Maybe love meant adjusting, making space, understanding, waiting, being the one who stayed calm, the one who stayed available, the one who found a way, even when there wasn't much left to give. And when that becomes familiar, boundaries can feel unnatural. Not because they are wrong, but because they interrupt a role you've carried for a very long time. You stop saying yes automatically. You stop softening every truth. You stop managing everyone's disappointment before allowing yourself to make a decision. And suddenly, something inside you becomes uncomfortable, because other people's reactions no longer feel predictable. The silence feels different. You notice how quickly you start taking responsibility for emotions that aren't yours. A small shift in someone's tone, a delayed reply, a distant message. And immediately you begin wondering if you've done something wrong. But maybe this discomfort isn't coming from the boundary itself. Maybe it's coming from no longer abandoning yourself in order to keep everything peaceful. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly choosing harmony over honesty. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it simply looks like saying yes when you mean no, explaining yourself over and over, remaining present long after you've disappeared internally, smiling through conversations that leave you feeling farther away from yourself. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. Inside, something slowly becomes heavier, because each time you leave yourself behind, a quiet distance begins to grow, not between you and other people, between you and yourself. And eventually, even small boundaries begin to feel enormous. Saying, I can't. Saying, not this time. Saying nothing at all. Simple things can suddenly carry enormous emotional weight. Not because the boundary is too big, but because you're no longer used to choosing yourself without permission. For many people, guilt arrives before peace, not because they've harmed someone, but because choosing themselves feels unfamiliar. You may still expect relief to appear immediately. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes what appears first is uncertainty. You sit with your decision and wonder whether you were too harsh. You think about changing your mind. You imagine making things easier for everyone else. And yet, somewhere underneath all of that, there is another feeling. Small, quiet, easy to miss. The feeling of not leaving yourself behind. Perhaps for the first time in a very long while, there can also be grief inside boundaries. Not grief for the boundary itself, but grief for what it quietly reveals. Sometimes a boundary shows you that certain relationships only felt stable when you kept abandoning yourself. As long as you adjusted, explained, stayed available, and carried more than you could hold, everything seemed calm. People were comfortable. The relationship felt familiar. Nothing appeared to be changing. And then you begin protecting yourself. You answer a little later. You stop over-explaining. You no longer say yes automatically. You become honest about your limits. And suddenly, something shifts. Not always dramatically. Sometimes the change is almost invisible. A little more distance, a little less warmth. Conversations that feel different. Silences that last longer. You begin noticing that some people knew how to receive your endless giving, but did not know how to meet your boundaries. That realization can hurt, because it forces you to sit with questions you may have avoided for a long time. Were they loving you? Or were they loving your availability? Were they close to you? Or close to the version of you that never asked for anything? There are no simple answers. And this is often where guilt becomes complicated. Because part of you still wants to return to what was familiar. Not because it felt good, but because it felt known. Self-abandonment can become familiar enough to feel like love. So when you stop doing it, The unfamiliar space that appears can feel lonely. You may miss who you used to be in relationships. The one who always understood. The one who never disappointed anyone. The one who could always make things easier, even when it came at your own expense. But missing that version of yourself does not necessarily mean you need to return to her. Sometimes you are simply grieving an identity that kept you connected to people, even while it kept you disconnected from yourself. And grief deserves space too. Because boundaries do not only change relationships, they change the relationship you have with yourself. Slowly, you begin noticing your own exhaustion sooner. You notice when something feels too heavy. You notice when your body grows quiet. You notice when you need rest before reaching complete depletion. These are small changes, quiet changes, the kind that almost go unnoticed, until one day you realize that you no longer ask permission before listening to yourself. And perhaps that is one of the quietest forms of healing, not becoming harder, not becoming distant, simply becoming someone who no longer leaves herself behind. There is no dramatic moment when this suddenly becomes easy. No clear lines separating guilt from peace. Only small moments. Moments when you notice that you no longer explain every decision. Moments when someone is disappointed and you don't immediately rush to fix it. Moments when silence no longer feels dangerous. Moments when you realize that caring about someone and protecting yourself can exist at the same time. Because boundaries are not always distance, they are not always rejection, and they are not always evidence that love has disappeared. Sometimes they are simply the place where you stop disappearing. That realization can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you have spent years believing that love required endless availability, especially if being needed became part of how you understood your worth. But slowly, something changes. Not all at once, quietly. You begin to notice that relationships capable of holding your boundaries often become calmer, softer, more honest. And the relationships that depended on your constant self-abandonment may begin to feel different. Not worse, just clearer. Because boundaries rarely change who people are. They often reveal what was already there. And perhaps that is why they can feel so unsettling. Not because you are becoming selfish, but because you are no longer leaving yourself every time someone asks. You can care deeply and still protect yourself. Both things can be true at the same time. And sometimes, that is where something quieter begins.